Hello Proponomics people, and welcome to my video from Wednesday the 28th of February 2024. And today I wanted to talk about the value of time. Now, I've been inspired to record this video by a whole number of different things. First of all, listened to a really interesting podcast this morning on my business partner Rod Turner's Rodcast, and that was with Paul Higgs, who's a pretty legendary land finder for Barratt Homes, and now a developer. Also trains a number of developers as well. What Paul doesn't know about finding land isn't worth knowing. And Paul also was one of the co-founders of Land Insights, which is one of the tools that some very large developers use, and also some smaller developers as well. Price can be quite high, but you need to have a reasonable sized development business to want to use it. But it's an interesting tool, and it's worth checking out if you need some prop tech to support you on your property journey. So Rod and Paul were talking on the Rodcast, and they were talking about what's wrong with the planning system. Paul's got some quite different views about what is the actual problem that needs to be solved, or what are the number of problems that need to be solved in order to free up or supply more housing, free up more land, all the rest of it. There's the inevitable conversation around green belts and things like that. But Paul actually quoted a few really interesting statistics. One, the build cost increase in the last 3 years is a larger increase in percentage terms than at any point since the Second World War. Now, I thought that was interesting because those 3 years, whilst there's been significant inflation, they're not the highest 3 years for inflation by any stretch of the imagination. If anybody lived through the 1970s and is watching this, they will know that inflation was far higher in the 1970s, but build costs weren't increasing in the same way. And of course, some of that is down to regulatory changes, compliance, all the rest of it. There is this kind of mismatch, just as there is in the private rental sector, with we want better compliance, we want better properties for tenants, we want better standards, but we don't want them to pay more for it. Well, that's an impossibility. And as you've seen over the past 7 or 8 years, as margins have been squeezed, as landlords have been hounded out the market really to a large extent, what happens? Fewer properties. What happens when prices start to go up? Rents start to go up, and that's the problem. But I want to bring this back to time. What's the problem with the planning systems? Well, we talk about under-resourced, planners are poorly paid. It's much more profitable to go and work in private practice in planning. You go and do your stripes, earn your stripes, do your training with councils. So that's the time when, as any business, you're putting money into individuals. You're not making money out of them. Not that councils are money making, unfortunately, but you know what I mean. They still have revenue and costs and theoretical contribution or profit or reserves, although not much if you look at the figures. So the councils effectively train them, and then they get salted off into private practice when they're already trained and ready. And of course, they get paid more money for doing that. And that's a bit of a sign of a broken system. Similar thoughts around the NHS at the moment, and doctors, and going off to Australia and Canada and Ireland and all the rest of it to get paid much more money when the country has effectively subsidised them through the university system. I'm not blaming the doctors that do that, can't blame them at all. You've got to probably put the blame on the government and what they've done to the medical profession since 2010 in terms of pay and all the rest of it, which has obviously been in the headlines quite significantly. So guess what? People behave as they are incentivised. But the point about the value of time is simple. If you massively slow down the planning process, and that's been the problem since COVID, that's been the thing that's really, really changed. A lot of the other stuff, the frameworks, the rules, the green belt, all the rest of it, there's constant problems, there's constant issues, there's constant political conflict. And as it goes, ultimately, a ruling Conservative Party do not like to have slack planning rules. They are protecting their main user base. Imagine the typical home counties dwellers who don't want building anywhere near them. It's as simple as that. It's NIMBYism on a huge scale, and they never want that. Actually, Labour have got form for slackening planning rules, requirements, improving what is and isn't green belt. Latest stats are saying that 13% of green belt is actually not green at all, and could be used and is worthwhile to build on in areas where new houses would be massively useful to the population as a whole. So that's worth considering, because that's not a small number, is it? 13%, 1/8 of all that green belt land that's not green. So, but going back to the time, it's the time that has stretched out over these past few years or so, taking double the amount of time for stuff to go through planning, literally double. Rod has said to me over recent months and years, instead of where we were looking at 12 months for this to go through, and he uses his data, he's pretty accurate, he's not unrealistic. If anything, he's pessimistic to the tune of being able to make a profit as a property developer, which is a pretty good skill to have. He was already out to using 2 years as the time frame instead of 1. So if you understand anything about returns, metrics, debt, all the rest of it, and there's videos if you want to go back into my advent calendar series from December last year about things like the internal rate of return, which I highly recommend you go and look at, then what you'll understand is if you elongate the time, by definition, if the returns stay the same, then you are providing lower IRRs and lower returns and less incentive for people to develop property. So that's probably in as bad a state as it's been at the moment. And I wanted to share with you a little story. I often look at these time-bound situations. Options is another one that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But this story is back from when I was studying my economics A-level. So many, many moons ago now. And my A-levels we were at a relatively early stage of A-levels becoming modular. So effectively, you did a term's work or perhaps 2 terms work, and then you sat a modular exam. And this was nice because it took big pressure off the final exam, and you were able to see how you were doing as you went along. You could also resit modules if you hadn't done very well. So it gave people multiple bites of the cherry if you were someone who perhaps didn't always have the best day on an exam day or got nervous or all the rest of it. Unfortunately, I was the annoying person at school who didn't struggle with that sort of stuff at all. If I learned one skill at school, it was how to pass exams. And that's a bit tragic, really, when you think about it. But I've used that skill throughout my life to understand how to work and operate within systems and work within the guidelines, but also maximise my efforts and what I've been doing and ultimately my profits. So maybe it wasn't a bad skill to be taught, but unfortunately, I had to transfer all of that over. And it took me many years to realise that was the skill that I was being taught. But nonetheless, I remember a module very well that was transport economics. The chief examiner, my economics tutor, he was an interesting character. He had been an investment banker and then had burnt out, frankly, in that career and had gone on to pasture out at teaching in leafy old Solihull. So that's what he was doing at the school. But of course, unique insight, bit of a volatile character as well, actually. So the teenage me was probably quite difficult to get along with. There's no two ways about that. And unfortunately, because I had quite a bit of natural ability, it seemed like I didn't have to put too much work in. Although what I really had was an ability to understand and process things quite quickly. And a lot of that was actually thanks to the way I was brought up. And I was fed a lot of academic material and semi-academic material. Montessori style, I suppose, is one way of looking at it when we were outside of school. And that did me a lot of favours in my very young developing brain and enabled me to become a pretty good student. So we were talking about transport economics. I sat the module. I got 100% in that module. It was the only economics module I got 100% in. The teacher flipped his lid and said it shouldn't be possible for someone to get 100% in an essay-based module, which, of course, I agree with him. But he was insistent that it must have been moderated upwards, my score in my essay. And he knew the chief examiner. The chief examiner was a lecturer at the University of Hull. He went out the room, this is typical of him, he flew out the room to go and call the chief examiner. And then he made the mistake of coming back after he'd made that call and told the whole class that actually my score hadn't been moderated upwards. It was the best essay the chief examiner had ever seen because I had an understanding of the value of time that other people didn't, that his third year degree students at the time didn't have. And I think that's what's enabled me to work through things like options and see opportunities and manage risks on them. So if we went back 10, 11, 12 years, I was saying, listen, options are risky because if the interest rate goes up and you're taking all these option agreements and you're paying the mortgage, and that's the nature of the agreement, what happens if the interest rate goes up? Your margin starts to get squeezed, etc., etc. Nobody really listened to me. Some people did options very, very skillfully, did very well. They didn't let that analysis piece put them off. And I'm not saying it should have put them off. I'm saying they should have looked at how they managed that risk and where the incidence of those rises would have fallen had they happened, right? Now you've got people trying to get rid of options that they've held for many years where they've just taken the cash flow. They haven't put the money back into the deal. And instead, they've just enjoyed it as income. And now they need to get rid of those options because they're paying base rate +2 on some of these old mortgages. So these are the sort of deals that are hanging around in the marketplace at the moment. And that is exactly why understanding the value of time, particularly when you use things like options, but also in development and investment, in many ways, time is everything. Because if you don't get your timings right, your returns will suffer.